Our speaker today, Rachel Sheir, is an award-winning essayist, writer, and critic whose work has been published in many newspapers and magazines, including the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. She is the author of Striptease, The Untold Story of the Girlie Show, Oxford University Press, Gypsy, The Art of the Tease, Yale, American Icons, The Steal, A Cultural History of Shoplifting, The Penguin Press, and Magnificent Disruptor, a biography of Betty Friedan in the Yale Jewish Lives series. She is founder and head of the Dramaturgy and Dramatic Criticism program at the Theater School at DePaul University. She lives in Chicago. Her program today is called Magnificent Disruptor, about Betty Friedan. I am happy to have Rachel Sheir here with us today.
I am going to talk about my recent biography of Betty Friedan, which, yes, is titled Betty Friedan, Magnificent Disruptor. And as Judy said, it's in the Yale Jewish Lives series, which is a series devoted to Jewish lives, but that is defined very broadly. Other people and figures in this series include Moses and Groucho Marx, just to give you an idea of the span, okay? And I just say that because, there was a lot of freedom in how I could write about Betty. So what I'm going to do today is to talk about the arc of Betty's life. I'm going to call her Betty because I spent 6 years on this book, and I feel very intimate with Betty, and it feels very cold and impersonal to call her Friedan. So I'm going to tell you about the arc of her life and the most important things that she did, of course, what she should be known and remembered for. But by way of getting into that story, I'm going to tell you how I came to write this biography, because as you may have observed from my first 3 books, which were about striptease and shoplifting, to then write the biography of Betty Friedan is not necessarily a natural progression, right? Yes, okay, so I'm going to take you back to 10 years ago. 2013. 2013 happened to be the 50th anniversary of The Feminine Mystique. The Feminine Mystique is Betty's most famous book, which it was published in 1963. It was a groundbreaking work. It was a huge bestseller. It made her a celebrity. I'm going to talk in detail about it a little later. What you need to know right now, however, is that it is known for starting second wave feminism and the feminist revolution in 1963. So this was the 50th anniversary of The Feminine Mystique in 2013, and I will confess, I, at the time, had not read The Feminine Mystique. However, I was asked to write a long literary essay about the 50th anniversary of The Feminine Mystique and some other books that were published that year, 2013, by younger feminists, right? Feminists in their 20s and 30s. I guess that would have been fourth wave feminism. There's different waves, right? First, second, third, fourth. So first of all, since I had never read The Feminine Mystique, obviously I began to read it, and I was shocked. I considered it at the time my mother's book, okay? But when I began to read it, I was actually more than shocked. I was blown away. It's an amazing book. First of all, It's very persuasively written. I'm going to read you a little chunk from it in a little bit later, and it's got a kind of force to the language. It's very beautiful. The Feminine Mystique is a polemic. It's a polemic about how women there's a conspiracy which is designed to keep women in the roles of wives and mothers, and will not allow them to pursue outside careers or other interests, right? At this time that Betty was writing, it didn't even necessarily have to be a career. What Betty was interested in the Feminine Mystique was the idea of women having something that they were passionate about that was beyond the family. So yes, as I said, I began to read it and I was blown away. It was so beautifully written. It was persuasive. It was a lot of things. It was also irritating and repetitive in places, and there were places where it's dated. It's a gigantic book. It's around 500 pages, so you can't expect a book that was essentially written in the late 50s to be completely of our moment. But there was a lot that was of our moment and that I recognized. Each chapter takes a certain realm. For example, there's one chapter on Madison Avenue, and it discusses the sexism on Madison Avenue. There's another chapter on psychoanalysis, Freud, and Freud's American interpreters. There's another chapter on higher education. Okay, so and each chapter goes into great detail about this conspiracy against women. So I read this book and I found it amazing. And then I read some of these other books that were written by the younger feminists, and I noticed that, first of all, they borrowed heavily from Betty's argument. Either they extended or amplified her argument, or they contradicted her, but they barely mentioned her. So it was as if in the years in between 1963 and 2013, that 50-year period, she had been erased. So I was surprised by this, and that was the piece that I wrote. And a lot of people liked the piece, and eventually I was asked to write a biography of Betty. And so when you're a biographer, one of the jobs that you have is to figure out what is it that other biographers, previous biographers, have not done, and what you would like to do better. And so, you know, the main thing that I tried to do that I felt had not been done because of my reading of the Feminine Mystique and my discovery that Betty had been erased, my main thrust was to kind of try and put her back in the center, or in our memory, right, in the middle of our cultural memory, and try and really examine what it is that she should be remembered for, and then, of course, what should we criticize her for. And so early on in my writing of the book, I encountered something else which would shape the way I wrote the book, and that was that both the previous round of biography, which was published in the 1990s, there were two pretty well-known biographies of Betty that came out in the late 90s, and also I began to do interviews of people who knew Betty. And the people who knew Betty, as well as these other biographies, focused, in my opinion, less on her accomplishments, which were enormous, than on her character. And so I could see right away that there was a tension between who she was and her character, and the things that she accomplished. And in part, in terms of the previous biographies, I came to believe that the reason those biographies were critical of Betty and her character was because Betty was still alive when they were written, and she didn't really agree with the way she was portrayed in those biographies, and so she gave the biographers a hard time, and that showed up in the writing. That's what happens. And so Betty's dates, by the way, are 1921 to 2006. So I started writing around 10 years after she died. And then my other experience that I will share with you from early on in my beginning to write the biography was that of interviewing women, mostly, who had known Betty. They either knew her from the National Organization for Women, which maybe some people in the audience were members of or even are members of. Betty founded that in 1966, 3 years after she wrote The Feminine Mystique. And a number of those women were still alive. Some of them are still alive. I just did an event with one of them in Dallas, in fact. She's 95, and she flew from Westchester to Dallas to do an event. So that's amazing. Many women who knew Betty in the 60s and 70s, they remembered mean things, essentially, that she said to them. And so that was a starting point. So I had these two pieces of the life of Betty Friedan. I had her accomplishments, writing The Feminine Mystique and starting now, and then I had her character, which people remembered as imperious and, she had a bad temper and so on. So in my biography, what I tried to do was honor both of those things. I didn't want to write a hagiography, right? But I also didn't want to shortchange her accomplishments. And so that's the book that's titled Magnificent Disruptor. And I wish that I could take credit for that great title, but actually it's something that Nancy Pelosi said in a eulogy. Yeah, I stole it. So now that's a brief preamble about how I came to write the book and what some of the challenges were. Now what I would like to do is talk a little bit about the arc of Betty's life, which I promised I would do. It's a fascinating 20th century life. The first thing that you need to know, if you don't know this, is that Betty was a Midwesterner by birth. She was born in Peoria, Illinois, and grew up there. Her family, she was Jewish. Her family were Reform Jews. They were the minority in Peoria, and they experienced some discrimination, as did Betty as a girl. Betty was the oldest child. Her father owned a jewelry store. I believe that in advertisements it's called the Tiffany's of the Midwest. Okay, it was a very successful jewelry store. And her mother was a homemaker. Her mother had wanted to go to Smith College in Northampton, Mass., the girls' school, single-sex college. But her mother's father, who came to America from Hungary, would not let his daughter go to college. So Betty's mother was thwarted, right, in her intellectual life. And so she married Harry Goldstein, who was the owner of the jewelry store, and he was quite a bit older than she was. They got married in 1920, right, around the time that women got the vote. And then in 1921, Betty was born. She was the oldest daughter of this marriage, and then right directly after that, there were two other children, Amy and Harry. And so Betty's mom, Miriam, was very beautiful, very poised, as I said, also very frustrated that she didn't have anything to do intellectually with her life. And Betty rebelled against Miriam, against her mother. In fact, one way that some scholars see the feminine mystique is as a rebellion against her mother. It's Betty saying, I didn't want to live the way my mother lived, right? And so how did she rebel? Well, from childhood, she had a bad temper, and there is documented proof of this in her archives, which are at the Schlesinger Library at Harvard. She fought with her sister, she fought with her brother, that kind of thing. I mean, that's pretty normal for siblings. But she fought pretty ferociously with them, I would say. She also read. She was an excellent student. She skipped 2 grades. That further alienated her, of course, in grade school and in high school. And then she wound up in 1938 going to Smith College, where her mother had not been able to go. Oh, I also should add, where Miriam was beautiful, Betty was kind of disheveled looking as a young person. And her sister Amy was also very beautiful. So Betty focused on her intellect. Okay, and so she went to Smith College in 38. At Smith College, she excelled. She was a brilliant student. Her teachers and the administrators at Smith, they talk about her with awe as one of the most brilliant students that Smith has ever had. She won all the prizes. She majored in psychology. She had briefly imagined that she would be either an actress or a writer, but then she abandoned, at least in college anyway, those pursuits, although she was the editor of the college newspaper. She was the editor-in-chief. She also was very interested in college in politics. She, for example, particularly left-leaning politics. This, of course, was late in the Depression, right, 1938. She was very interested in labor politics. She attended, as a summer program, the Highlander Folk School, which is a labor kind of summer camp in Tennessee. And she was transformed by that, and she wanted to do good, right? So she wanted to be a psychologist, but she also wanted to do good. So there was a conflict in her about how she could best contribute. She graduated from Smith in 42, and she went for 1 year to Berkeley College, but in the grad school, Berkeley Grad School in psychology. And there, she studied with many greats like Erik Erikson and others, but halfway through that year, she dropped out for a number of reasons, and she moved to New York, and she started working as a journalist for a radical newspaper. And so she worked at this radical, it was really a trade publication, right, a wire service, and they so the articles that they wrote were disseminated to many different newspapers. And while she was on the staff of that newspaper, she wrote about sexism, she wrote about Jim Crow laws, she wrote about anti-Semitism. She wrote a lot of really amazing investigative pieces also about fascism. She thought that fascism was coming to America, like a lot of left-leaning people of that time. And then she got married in 46, and she started a family. She had her oldest son, Daniel, and she would go on to have 2 more children, Jonathan and Emily. And eventually the family moved upstate New York to a bedroom community of New York in Rockland County. And Betty had to give up, obviously, working full-time as a journalist. This was also the era of Joe McCarthy, and so those trials were happening, and she was very concerned about that. But by the mid-50s, she had started doing freelance work for mainstream women's magazines such as Ladies' Home Journal and McCall's and read book, but she was writing about completely different subjects now. Now, in the late 50s, she was writing about women's struggles, specifically middle-class women's struggles, to balance career and family. And so that brings me to The Feminine Mystique, her great book, and how it got started. There are many different places to talk about where it got started, but one place is 1957, the summer of 1957, she went to her 15-year reunion at Smith College. And she realized that she was one of the only mothers who was still working. And so out of that, so in other words, she had had this incredibly privileged education, but few people in her cohort were, were continuing to work. So what she was very, upset. She was very shaken by this, really. And what she did was she created a survey that she could give to her cohort. And the survey had questions, all different sorts of questions. It was a kind of sociological survey about the state of the housewife/woman in the United States circa 1957. So she sent out these surveys, and she began to write an article based on the results of the survey. And the article was titled something like, "Is Education Wasted on Women?" Okay, but she had a lot of trouble selling this article. In other words, the women's magazines that she had been writing for did not really want to buy the article as she had written it. They wanted her to make it more positive sounding, and it was not very positive sounding, right? Because her essential thesis was that most women were no longer taking advantage of the brilliant education they had received. But Betty, one of the qualities of her character was that she was incredibly stubborn, right? Incredibly stubborn. So she just kept doing more research, and she kept interviewing more women, and she kept sending out the article. And finally, out of that came the book that was The Feminine Mystique. I think she sold it to W.W. Norton in 1958, and it was published in 1963. So just working on the book took her about 5 years to write it. It was a difficult process because, as I said, she had 3 children, and she had a husband, and she did not have a great marriage. In fact, I would say it was not a good marriage at all. It was violent and volatile, and in some ways, she and her husband, Carl, were ill-suited to each other, and he was not supportive of her doing this project or continuing to work, continuing to write. And then she had 3 school-age children, so it's difficult to balance all of that. But again, she figured out ways to do it. One of the famous stories about this is that she would not answer the door when her kids knocked on the attic door, which is where she was working, and they would say, "Mommy, Mommy, I fell down and, bruised my knee," and she wouldn't answer, right? Things like that. So she figured out ways to protect her writing time. She also would go into New York, and she would work there. She would take the train or bus in with Carl, and she would go to the New York Public Library where she had a carrel, and she would work there. And so anyway, little by little, the book got done. And the book came out in February 1963. As I said, it was a phenomenal hit. It made Betty a celebrity. Women, for the rest of Betty's life, they would come up to her and they would say, "You changed my life." The main thing that the book did for women was, I like to say that it threw the first punch, right? It carved out a space where the category of women could be talked about, right? That no one was doing that. It's not that the ideas that Betty was putting forward were new. It was that she was a great popularizer of all of these ideas, and women, upon reading the book, no longer felt alone. Actually, I will read you now a little tiny bit from, just so that you can know if those of you probably few people have read the book these days, and certainly not recently. So this is probably the most famous paragraph in the book, which is the first paragraph. Okay, so I'll just read it to you. The problem lay buried, unspoken for many years in the minds of American women. It was a strange stirring, a sense of dissatisfaction, a yearning that women suffered in the middle of the 20th century in the United States. Each suburban wife struggled with it alone as she made the beds, shopped for groceries, matched slipcover material, ate peanut butter sandwiches with her children, chauffeured Cub Scouts and brownies, lay beside her husband at night. She was afraid to ask, even of herself, the silent question, is this all? Okay. And I also will read you, the last paragraph, which is, I think, one of the things about the feminine mystique is that it's not exactly political in the sense that we think of political. It doesn't really have any suggestions, except, women should have something that they're passionate about. That's a suggestion. But it doesn't have any suggestions like down with the patriarchy or anything. In fact, au contraire, Betty really loved men, and she wanted men to be part of any revolution that women were having. But so anyway, I'll read you the last paragraph just so that you can hear how she ends the book. Who knows what women can be when they are finally free to become themselves? Who knows what women's intelligence will contribute when it can be nourished without denying love? Who knows of the possibilities of love when men and women share not only children, home, and garden, not only the fulfillment of their biological roles, but the responsibilities and passion of the work that creates the human future and the full human knowledge of who we are? It has barely begun, the search of women for themselves, but the time is at hand when the voices of the feminine mystique can no longer drown out the inner voice that is driving women on to become complete. Yeah, that's the ending of the book. It's beautiful, yeah. So I want to now talk a little bit about what happened after the feminine mystique. As I said, the book was a huge success, overwhelming success. It made Betty a celebrity. The whole family moved back to New York to the Dakota building on the Upper West Side, which, as some of you may know, is where it's a building full of celebrities. Yoko Ono lived there, and so on. And she began to tour the country to talk about her book. She went on television. The book was, as I said, received very, very fervently by many women. It was also criticized from the moment it started. It was the moment it was published. It was criticized for only not including women of color or working class women was one critique. Another critique was it borrowed too heavily from Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, which had been published in 1953. Those were really the main criticisms that attacked the book in the beginning, and they sort of haunted the book and continue to haunt it. Betty, though, in addition to traveling, she also immediately began work on another project which she felt addressed some of these criticisms. That project was to interview women who post-feminine mystique, right? Women who were successfully balancing work and children, having children and having a family, having a husband. She flew all over the country doing interviews for this book. She interviewed a much wider swath of women than appeared in The Feminine Mystique. However, she never finished this book. what is the reason for that? I believe if she had finished this book, her reputation would be much different today. But she never finished the book because in 1964, the Civil Rights Act passed. And Betty and other women in Betty's circle, and really women all across the country, looked at the Civil Rights Act and were said to themselves and to each other, well, wait a sec. We want a Civil Rights Act for women, right? We want this too. And they were impatient because they felt that women felt that they were being dismissed as a group, right? They felt that they were not that much closer to equality legally than they had been before the feminine mystique. Now, what I mean by that is, in 63, in the 50s, the laws were very discriminatory towards women. Just one example of this is that sexism in help wanted ads, right? You could say, you know, I want a cute girl to do this and this and this. Okay, so this is just the background to explain why women were impatient in 1964 and were becoming impatient. And so Betty and some other women began to think there should be a new women's group, an advocacy group for women. They called it the NAACP for Women. And they met in Washington and other places. They were comprised of many women who had been in government working away in sexist conditions for a long time. There were also women from other realms of society, from higher ed, and so on and so on. And so they got together and they tried to form an independent group. And Betty, that group was the National Organization for Women. I can... Okay, so I bring you now to 1966, to the summer of 1966. And so, you know, a point I want to make before I read to you a little bit from this section is that it's a big difference to be a writer and to write a best-selling book and to be the leader of a national organization. And so these women were, you know, they begged Betty, they asked her multiple times, please, we want you to be president. And at first, she didn't want to. And the reason was she knew that she didn't have the temperament to be the leader of this kind of movement, right? As she said herself, I have a writer's temperament. However, the women kept asking because she was a celebrity and they felt that they needed someone with national recognition, national name recognition. And so they kept asking, and so finally Betty agreed to spearhead the National Organization for Women as it was being formed. And that's really when she started to do that is really when you know, the complaints about her character began to rise, right? Because, as I said, it's difficult to lead this kind of organization. So I want to give you an idea, though, of what I'm talking about. So this scene is set at there's a conference in June of 1966 of women on the President's Commission on the Status of Women. And this is where a lot of women who were interested in founding something like that what would become the National Organization for Women, it's where they met. And they were discouraged, though, because a lot of people thought, well, we already have, you know, the Chamber of Commerce, and we have the women's groups of this and that, and we don't need a new group. Like, why do we need a new group? And Betty wanted a new group. Okay, so this section that I'm just going to read you is about how they met. The women met in Betty's hotel room, what happened there, okay? So here is this a very important meeting. So sorely irritated, Friedan invited Polly Murray and a group of women to her room at the Washington Hilton that night. Murray joined, as did Dorothy Hayner and Carolyn Davis of the Women's Department of the Oops, sorry, I'm sorry, I apologize. Murray joined, as did Dorothy Hayner and Carolyn Davis of the Women's Department of the UAW. Friedan had met them while researching her still uncompleted second book. There was also Catherine K. Clarenbach, head of the Wisconsin Commission on the Status of Women, Mary Eastwood, and Catherine Conroy, who worked for the Communications Union. Conroy and Clarenbach wanted to work through existing channels by introducing a motion condemning the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Murray, armed with a yellow legal pad, sided with Friedan's activist approach. At around 11 p.m., Nancy Knack, a young dean at the University of Wisconsin sitting on the floor, dared to wonder aloud if the world needed a new women's organization. Friedan shouted, "Who invited you? Get out, get out. This is my room and my liquor." She stormed into the bathroom and locked herself in. When she came out, Kay Clarenbach was defending Knack. "I invited her," she pleaded. At first, Knack refused to leave, but she soon made her own exit. As for Friedan, in her 1976 account of this evening, she used macho language to cast herself as a martyr. They, the other women, left in what I felt was a sanctimonious disapproval of me for suggesting anything so radical as an independent organization, and Polly Murray, the Black scholar who triggered me first, and my indefatigable friends from the Washington Underground, and Dorothy Hayner from UAW, and I just looked at one another and shrugged. Women, what can you expect? Okay? So she could be difficult, is what I'm saying, okay? But I don't, in telling you this story, I don't mean to diminish the importance of founding the National Organization for Women. It was and is an amazing organization. It's significant that it is still today in operation when most of the other organizations have, have fallen by the wayside. Okay, thank you. Okay, and it, as I said, it did not make men the enemy. It tried to unite diverse women in one room. I mean, it is and was a really amazing organization. Okay, I want to leave enough time for questions because I find that people really want to talk about Betty. So I just want to say a few more things, which are briefly. So, what happened then? You know, the first 4 years of Betty's presidency were an amazing, there's an amazing list of what they accomplished, but they didn't accomplish everything. Betty stepped down in 1970, but she continued to found other organizations. For example, the National Women's Political Caucus, which was dedicated to equality in women's representation just politically. She wrote other books. She became known for her centrism, especially as mainstream feminism became more radical, like in 68, 69, and so on. Another important criticism of Betty is that she did not believe that what happened in the bedroom should be a central part of the feminist platform. And so this resulted in a fissure between her and many of the feminists, especially lesbian feminists, who were trying to come out of the closet and wanted their politics to be given equal weight. And again, Betty used language that, when I say it today, you're just going to shrink. She used the phrase lavender menace, okay, to describe this group of women. But I tell you this phrase, but I also want to say, it came from when she said it, as she, like many of the other things she said that sound sensational, especially in our era, it came from a place of her worrying that the feminist movement would shatter if too much emphasis were put on what she called sexual politics and what is essentially identity politics. She felt that the core areas, which for her were equality of pay, equality of political representation, and representation in the boardroom, and childcare, and reproductive rights, if I didn't say that, those issues would be sidelined because they weren't as sexy as talking about somebody's private life. She worried that the media would pay undue attention to that part of the feminist platform, and so she was against this. But that did create a divide between her and many other women, particularly younger women in the movement. But she kept fighting for women's rights. I want to just hit 1981, which is the year that the Equal Rights Amendment failed. Betty was a huge champion for the Equal Rights Amendment. I also want to note that in later years, although she had been very hostile to Peoria during the beginning of her adult life, in later years she came to understand that she had been created by Peoria and that accounted for some of her ideas and some of her conservatism. As I said, she died in 2006, and almost up until her death, she was delivering speeches for women's justice, and she was encouraging younger women to take risks. And she was worried about her legacy and the legacy of the women's movement. So I think that she's a phenomenal figure, and I really encourage you to read The Feminine Mystique. It's a great book, and to investigate her more fully. Okay, and I would love to hear questions now. Thank you.
I think at one time there was a debate between Betty Friedan and Phyllis Schlafly about the Equal Rights Amendment.
Yes.
And
yes.
there might have been a reference to Betty Friedan suggesting that Phyllis Schlafly be hung as a witch.
Yes. Yes.
Can you fill that out a little?
Yeah. Betty.
I disagreed with her.
What? Betty I wrote about this for the Chicago Tribune in June. Betty debated Phyllis Schlafly a few times. I believe the first time was in 1973. Yeah, and she did say that. What I want to say is, Betty's concern about how the media would cover feminism was serious, and so she did say, something like that, something really just derogatory and inflammatory, which is insane. However, before that happened, there were a whole lot of other things that happened. Namely, there was a serious conversation about reproductive rights, and also Phyllis Schlafly's movement, anti-feminist movement, and women. But the thing that got picked up by the New York Times and other newspapers was that quote. So to me, of course, I don't, justify Betty using this inflammatory language, and I think it hurt her, and I think it hurt the feminist movement, right? But I partially lay it at the door of the media. I think the media was of the time when you read the, newspapers, contemporary newspapers, they were incredibly contemptuous towards feminists and feminism. They described, those mini-skirted wearing, they made them into buffoons. And I have mixed feelings. There were many of these incidents. I think Betty was really worried about Phyllis Schlafly, and she was really worried that because this identity politics had become so central in feminism, that Phyllis Schlafly was going to appeal to the group that Betty thought that she should be appealing to, which was really mainstream women who were trying to balance marriage and a career or a job, and she was worried that those women were just going to go over to Schlafly. So she felt she had to do something sensational. That was her strategy, often. Yeah.
What was precisely the controversy between Betty and Gloria Steinem? Was it a mere clash of personalities, ambitions, and leadership, or were there serious philosophical differences between them?
It's hard to be precise about it. It's a variety of things. One thing is ageism, or an age difference, a generation difference. Gloria was 12 years younger than Betty. Actually, Gloria was never a member of the National Organization for Women. Gloria was more interested in radical politics, and Simone de Beauvoir, Kate Millett, and so on. And whereas, as I said, Betty was more of a centrist. So there were ideological differences. Also, in the National Women's Political Caucus, which was co-founded by Betty, Gloria, and Bella Abzug and Gloria both wanted it to be a progressive organization, and Betty wanted to include Republicans. And that was a huge point of contention. However, it was not only ideological. Excuse me. Betty was jealous of Gloria. Gloria was very beautiful. She was very tall. She was very polished. And she got a lot of media attention that Betty felt should be hers, and she did not feel that Gloria was using it in a way that was beneficial to the women's movement. It wasn't Gloria's fault, but people gave things to her. For example, both Betty and Gloria went to Smith College, but Smith gave Gloria a prize before they gave Betty a prize, that kind of thing. It's just people would give her things. And Betty did a similar thing to Gloria that she did to Phyllis Schlafly. She would attack her, and it would be quoted in the media. And that made Betty look bad, whereas Gloria never responded. She took the high road. So there was a huge break in 1972 or 1971, and they never spoke after that, really. Yeah.
Were there concrete changes in laws, or what exactly did now under her leadership accomplish?
Yes, many things. One thing was to do away with sexist language in job ads. That was one thing. Another thing was to do away with weight limitations that stewardesses had to, they had to weigh in. Betty and Now did away with that. What else did they do? Betty, in those first 4 years, a lot of what she did was travel all the time to different cities and try to start chapters of Now. Some of those were integrated, others were not integrated, but she was a tireless campaigner for Now. Now, probably the biggest thing, or one of the biggest things Betty did during her tenure was the Women's Strike for Equality, which was in the summer of 1970. That was a nationwide march. In every city had one, or most cities had one. Women went down the main drags. It was a commemoration of suffrage. That was the thing that really moved Now from a grassroots organization to a national organization. Those are a few things that come to mind. But there were many laws. There was a Supreme Court justice who was both racist and sexist, and they killed that nomination. Yeah.
How did Betty do dealing with people like LBJ, for instance? and his attitude toward women?
Yeah, I mean, she thought that LBJ, did not do enough for women, not surprisingly. I mean, they didn't have direct, like, fisticuffs or anything. I mean, the things I remember her complaining that the things that he awarded her and other women were just these token things. That happened in the time period between the publication of The Feminine Mystique and the starting of Now. Was she became very frustrated with LBJ, and actually at this conference that I was describing, LBJ was there. And Betty was very dissatisfied. He made these remarks about the Rose Garden and, how great it was. I mean, he didn't really talk about women and women's accomplishments. He wasn't really, as you're pointing out, he wasn't really that interested in it.
Oh, okay.
I think Betty also had an effect on the research done on mothers and children. I was working at NIH in the early 60s, and one of the main questions on one of the studies was, if a mother works, will this hurt the child in the long run? And there was a longitudinal study, and you probably all know the answer.
And we have time for 2 more questions.
Could you say something about her Zionism that was mentioned in some of the publicity for your talk?
Sure. I can talk a little bit about Betty. As I said, she was Jewish. She was from a Jewish family. They did experience discrimination when she was a young person, and her family experienced discrimination. But she herself was really, I would say, she was a cultural Jew until, I'm trying to trace for you the kind of the arc of her, how she got to her Zionism, which was not until the 80s. I mean, she was a cultural Jew, and then she was very into things like SLN and the human potential movement. I don't know if anybody in this room remembers that. Okay, things that people from that era were into, and also some of the more spiritual dimensions of Judaism. And it wasn't really until the 1970s, the early 70s, when she first went to Israel, that Israel was not on her radar, until 73 when she first went there. And then in 75, the big thing was 75, she went to an international women's conference in Mexico City and became aware of anti-Semitism in the women's movement. And that's where she kind of became turned on to Zionism, I would say, and became very interested in going to Israel and helping Israeli women create their own independent women's movement. Just to go back for a second, when she first went to Israel, in 73, the Feminine Mystique had not yet been translated into Hebrew. And so she arrived, and she was very angry about that. And also Golda Meir did not meet with her, and she was very angry about that. But then later, after the Six-Day War, there was a kind of change, a shift in Israel. I think prior to that, Israeli women didn't think they needed a women's movement. But by 84, when Betty went on this very important for her trip to Israel, there was a sense that they needed something. So her Zionism came out of what she saw in the women's movement, anti-Semitism in the women's movement, and this kind of linking totalitarian countries, like linking anti-Semitism and the feminist movement. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm very curious, how did Betty Friedan's public presence impact her family?
Great question. Well, let's see. Again, it's hard for me to answer this briefly. I think when she first published The Feminine Mystique and became a celebrity, that put an enormous strain on an already strained marriage. That's one thing. And then another thing is that she herself was terrified, I would say from, I don't know, 63 to 70, because she got divorced in 70 or 71, I think the divorce was finalized, but she was terrified that it would come out that her marriage was violent and, that she had a bad marriage and so on. And that the women's movement would be discredited and that she would be discredited. So she was thinking about this all the time. So it had that impact on it. Her children all have done very well. They're very successful and they have their own families. One is a MacArthur Genius Grant award-winning physicist, another one is a pediatrician, and another one is a architect and engineer. So the children have all kind of flourished. I think at the time it was difficult, right, when the children were growing up. But the thing about that is that the child that it affected the most was Emily, the youngest daughter. The two sons were really out of the house pretty much. It was really, there was a lot of turbulence between Emily and her mother. And Emily at one point famously said, "I'm not a feminist," right? In public. And of course that was quoted everywhere, but then she retracted it. She changed her, when she went to med school, she changed her mind. So it was complicated, in short. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks.